I want you to step inside a highly specific moment in time with us today.
Right. We are physically dialing the clock way, way back.
Exactly. Like 90,000 years back.
Yeah.
Straight into the absolute heart of the Pleistocene.
Right in the grip of the last ice age.
Yeah, and we're standing in the Altai Mountains of Siberia.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it's technically summer in this scenario, but the air still has this razor-sharp bite to it.
Oh, yeah, the kind of cold that would just cut right through a modern winter coat.
Seriously. So you can hear the icy water of the Annie River just rushing over the stones. And if you look down the bank of that winding river, you see a 13-year-old girl.
Just a normal teenager.
Right. She's just walking along the water's edge, maybe kicking the dirt, scanning the shallows for something shiny.
It's a profoundly human, really relatable scene. Just a teenager, probably a little bored, navigating the landscape around her home.
But the thing is, her biology represents one of the most staggering scientific blind spots in our modern understanding of the world.
Absolutely. Because if you were standing on that riverbank and you looked at her...
I mean, like, truly observed her physical form.
Right. Your brain would immediately register this uncanny valley effect. She wouldn't look quite like you.
The proportions would be off.
Mm-hmm.
The robusticity of her bones, the shape of her brow.
But she wouldn't look like a Neanderthal either.
Which is the crazy part. Biologically speaking, this teenage girl is a ghost.
And she remained a ghost for the entirety of modern scientific history. Up until incredibly recently, we assumed we had the late Pleistocene human map completely filled in.
And that is the part that just completely shatters my sense of the historical timeline.
This girl,
who the scientific community now affectionately calls Denny.
Yeah, Denny.
She represents an entire massive branch of the human family tree. And we didn't know she existed.
We had no idea her species existed.
Right. The discovery of her people didn't happen in, the 1800s alongside the Neanderthals. It happened in 2010.
Which is functionally yesterday in scientific terms. I mean, it's a massive lesson in humility for the field.
Oh, for sure.
We were operating under this really neat, tidy narrative, right? Like Homo sapiens burst out of Africa, Neanderthals were holding down the frozen forts in Europe, and maybe a few relic populations of Homo erectus were fading away in Asia.
That was the absolute consensus. We were literally walking around with iPhones in our pockets, completely oblivious to the fact that there was a massive third player in the late human game.
Hiding right under our noses.
And to understand how this newly discovered chapter of humanity changes absolutely everything about who we are.
And we mean that literally regarding the DNA currently pumping through your veins.
Yes. We have to start at the scene of the ultimate scientific breakthrough. A massive prehistoric hotel in Siberia.
The Denisova cave.
So set the scene for this cave. What are we looking at?
Well, it sits about 28 meters above the river valley, and the geology of it is crucial to the story. This isn't some cramped, claustrophobic crack in the rock that you have to, belly crawl into.
Right.
It is a vast limestone shelter. It spans nearly 3,000 square feet. Yeah, it features a high-vaulted central chamber with these extensive side galleries branching off.
So if you're a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer, this is basically the ultimate luxury real estate.
Oh, without a doubt. You have the elevation to track migrating herds of megafauna moving through the valley below.
You've got immediate access to fresh glacial meltwater.
Exactly. And the thermal mass of the cave walls keeps the internal temperature remarkably stable. It shields you from the bitter, fatal extremes of the Siberian winter.
And that stability is the key.
It is. That stability is why the cave was continuously occupied for a staggering 280,000 years.
250,000 years.
Successive waves of entirely different hominins used it as a refuge. But that same thermal stability is also what created the perfect taphonomic conditions.
Taphonomic meaning like how things fossilize.
Right. The ideal environment for preserving biological material over hundreds of millennia. It basically acted like a prehistoric refrigerator.
Which is amazing. But I have to bring up the name of the cave itself because it's just a brilliant historical irony.
It really is.
It has absolutely nothing to do with ancient languages or, like, the indigenous people of the Altai. It comes from an 18th century Russian Orthodox hermit named Dionysi.
Or Denis.
Right, Denis. And he retreated into this massive cave seeking a life of absolute uninterrupted solitude.
He just wanted to pray and be left alone. He isolated himself completely from the world.
And because he lived there, the local villagers just casually started calling it Denis's Cave.
Yep.
The guy seeks total anonymous isolation, and centuries later, his name is prominently bolted onto one of the most famous hominin lineages in the history of paleontology.
Poor Denis. He really didn't get his wish.
Not at all. So fast forward to 2008. Russian archaeologists are working in this cave. But they aren't looking for a new human species, are they?
No, not at all. A paleontologist named Nikolai Ovodov was leading an excavation, and his specific target was ancient canidids.
Like dogs.
Yeah, he was looking for the evolutionary precursors to modern dogs and extinct Pleistocene wolves. And excavating a cave with 280,000 years of continuous occupation is just a mind-numbing logistical challenge.
I can't even imagine. You are essentially sifting through 250,000 years of prehistoric garbage.
Exactly. Just endless compacted layers of crushed-up animal bones, the remnants of ancient dinners.
And amidst all that trash, he finds it.
Amidst thousands of these fragmented bones, Ovidov found something tiny. The distal phalanx of the fifth finger.
The very tip of a pinky bone.
Right. From a juvenile.
Just a single tiny pinky bone.
It was so small and unassuming that, no one threw a parade. It was just bagged and tagged.
With the pretty safe logical assumption that it belonged either to a modern human or a Neanderthal.
Exactly. Since we already knew Neanderthal populations had pushed into the Siberian region, it made sense.
But because it was hominin bone, they sent it to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany.
Straight to the team led by Svante Pääbo.
Now, Pääbo's team was pioneering the extraction of highly degraded ancient DNA.
They were the best in the world at it. But they couldn't rely on nuclear DNA right away because it degrades too quickly. It breaks down into these tiny, unreadable fragments over tens of thousands of years.
So instead, they targeted mitochondrial DNA.
Which is the absolute gold standard for this kind of deep-time lineage tracing.
Break that down for us. Why is mitochondrial DNA better for old bones?
Well, every cell in your body has only one nucleus, right? But it contains hundreds or even thousands of mitochondria.
A powerhouse of the cell.
Exactly, the cellular power plants. So right off the bat, mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is far more abundant. It massively increases the odds that some fragments survive the millennia.
And there's something else special about it, too. It bypasses the whole shuffling process.
Yes, meiotic recombination. When two humans reproduce, the nuclear DNA from the mother and the father gets shuffled together like a deck of cards.
It creates a chaotic, completely unique mashup.
But the mtDNA is completely different. It is inherited exclusively from the mother, completely intact, without any shuffling from the father's side.
So it passes down the maternal line generation after generation.
Exactly. And because it doesn't undergo that genetic recombination, the only way it changes is through random natural mutations.
And those mutations happen at a mathematically predictable background rate.
You've got it. So it acts as a molecular clock. If you know the speed at which the clock ticks,
the mutation rate.
Right. You can count the differences between two samples and calculate exactly how much time has passed since they shared a common ancestor.
So let's talk about what happened when they actually looked at this pinky bone. Because this is where the Leipzig lab encountered a massive anomaly.
It was huge. Let's look at the baseline metrics first. If you compare the mitochondrial DNA of a modern human living today with the mitochondrial DNA of a Neanderthal, you will find a difference of roughly 202 base pairs.
Okay, so 202. That number quantifies the evolutionary distance between us and our closest known cousin.
Exactly. So the team runs a sequencer on this tiny juvenile pinky bone, fully expecting it to hit that 202 mark.
Because they assume it's just a Neanderthal.
Right. They run it, and the machine returned 385 base pair differences.
385. Which completely shatters the paradigm instantly.
It was almost double the genetic distance.
I mean, I want to push back on this a bit, because how can science be so sure about an entire new branch of humanity based on just the tip of a pinky? Like, isn't that a massive leap?
It sounds like it, but the genetics are mathematically undeniable. It didn't match modern humans, it didn't match Neanderthals, it didn't match any known genetic sequence on the entire planet.
Wow.
And by running that molecular clock backward based on the 385 differences, they calculated that this distinct lineage had split away from the human family tree roughly 1 million years ago.
1 million years ago, all from the tip of a pinky.
It really is incredible.
It's the biological equivalent of finding an absolutely pristine fingerprint at a crime scene, but the database says the suspect doesn't exist.
It is a perfect analogy.
You have their unique, undeniable identifier. You know they were in the room, but you have absolutely no idea what they look like. You don't know their height, their skull shape, their biomechanics, nothing.
It was a complete inversion of traditional paleoanthropology.
How so?
Well, historically, the field has been driven by morphology. Someone discovers a massive skull eroding out of a hillside. They measure the cranial capacity. They examine the dental arcade, and they define a new species based on physical traits.
Right, you find the bones first.
Exactly. And then, if they are miraculously lucky, decades later, they might pull a fragmented genome from it. But the Denisovans were the exact opposite. They were a genome in search of a fossil.
We had the invisible genetic blueprint, but we were completely blind to the physical reality of who they were.
And human curiosity demands a face. The math proved the branch existed, but to understand how a species mechanically interacted with its environment, we needed a skull.
And to find that face, the story pivots away from the sterile, high-tech sequencing machines of Germany.
It takes a wild turn.
Because, ironically, the skull we needed had already been sitting in a muddy, abandoned well in China for nearly 80 years.
The Harbin skull, often referred to as Homo longi or Dragon Man.
Dragon Man. And the provenance of this fossil reads like a geopolitical thriller.
It really does. We have to establish the context of 1933 to understand it.
Right, so 1933, this is during the brutal Japanese occupation of Manchuria in northeast China.
Right. And a Chinese laborer was part of a construction crew. They were building a bridge over the Songhua River.
And just for context, in Mandarin, Songhua translates to the Black Dragon River, hence the name.
Exactly. So while he's excavating the thick, dense river mud for the bridge supports, his shovel hit something hard. He pulled up this remarkably complete, massively robust, fossilized human skull.
And even without any formal scientific training, the sheer size and weight of this thing made it obvious to him it was something profoundly important.
But he's working under the boot of an occupying military force.
Right, the Japanese authorities.
He recognized its immense cultural and historical value immediately, and he made this calculated, incredibly risky decision. He knew that if he handed it over, it would likely be shipped out of the country forever.
So he kept quiet.
He wrapped the skull carefully, carried it away from the site, and hid it deep inside the brickwork of an abandoned water well.
Which is just so cinematic, and the timeline of it sitting there is what really bends my mind.
Oh, it's wild.
It sits in the dark through the rest of the 1930s. It survives World War II. The Chinese Communist Revolution sweeps the nation. The Cold War happens. The moon landing, the invention of the microchip, the entirety of the internet.
The complete scientific revolution of DNA sequencing is born and perfected while it's in there.
Yes. And the whole time, the physical face of the Denisovans is just quietly waiting in a dark, damp well in Harbin.
It is an absolute miracle of preservation. The anaerobic conditions of the mud and the relatively stable temperature of the well likely saved it from total degradation.
So how did it finally get out?
Finally, literally on his deathbed, the laborer told his family the secret. They investigated the well, recovered the skull, and it was ultimately donated to the Geoscience Museum of Hebei GEO University.
Wow.
And by 2021, and with even more rigorous data solidifying the consensus around 2025, scientists finally had the technology to properly analyze it.
Okay, so let's look at this face. When the scientists clean off the decades of mud, what are they actually looking at? What are the biomechanics of Dragon Man?
The immediate overwhelming impression is its sheer scale. It is arguably the most pristine, complete, archaic human skull ever recovered, and it is massive.
How massive?
The internal cranial capacity, the volume housing the brain, is roughly 1,420 milliliters.
Which means his brain was essentially the same size as ours, right?
Usually slightly larger than the global modern human average.
Wait, really? A larger brain than us?
Yes. The neurological engine was immense, but the architectural housing of that brain was radically different from a modern human.
Break that down for us.
Homo sapiens are characterized by our high, globular, domed foreheads. Our skulls are spherical. The Harbin skull is long, low, and slopes backward. It's shaped much more like a rugby ball.
A rugby ball? And what about the brow ridges?
Massive,
Oh.
thick, and continuous. Just a solid bar of bone sitting above the eyes, far more pronounced than even the classic Neanderthal morphology.
Okay.
And below those brows, the face is exceptionally broad and flat, dominated by these striking, almost perfectly square-shaped eye sockets.
Square eye sockets. That paints such a vivid, almost alien picture. And I imagine the jaw mechanics were just as robust.
The dental arcade is enormous. It features these massive molars rooted into a powerfully built upper jaw. But the most defining diagnostic feature, the negative space that instantly separates him from us, is the total absence of a chin.
A lack of a chin. It's funny, you don't really realize how unique the chin is until you look at evolutionary history.
Right, the projecting bony chin at the bottom of the mandible is an exclusively Homo sapien trait. No other hominin lineage possesses it.
Really? Just us.
Just us. Dragon Man's massive lower jaw just sloped straight back diagonally, blending directly into a thick, heavily muscled neck.
Wow.
And anchored in the center of that broad face was an absolutely cavernous nasal cavity.
Which, when we think about evolutionary adaptation, isn't just a cosmetic quirk, right? There's a serious thermodynamic reason for a nose that big.
It is a critical survival mechanism. A massive nasal passage acts as a biological HVAC system.
Like an internal humidifier and heater.
Exactly. When you are surviving in the brutal deep freeze winters of northern China or the Siberian steppes, drawing in massive gulps of sub-zero, bone-dry air during a hunt can physically damage the delicate alveolar tissue of the lungs.
That makes total sense. You'd freeze your lungs from the inside out.
Right. So the extensive nasal conchae inside a large nose create turbulence, warming and moistening that freezing air before it hits the respiratory tract.
So we have this incredibly clear physical profile. A rugby ball-shaped skull, square eyes, huge jaw, no chin, and a massive thermal regulating nose.
That's the face.
But how did the scientific community conclusively link this specific fossil pulled from a Chinese well to the genetic ghost data from a pinky bone in Siberia? I mean, they are thousands of miles apart.
That presented a formidable taphonomic challenge. Because the skull had been sitting in an unsealed well for nearly a century, subjected to varying moisture and temperature fluctuations, the DNA inside the bone matrix was highly degraded.
So the normal DNA sequencing wasn't going to work.
Yeah, traditional sequencing wasn't going to be enough, no. However, the skull still had one massive molar anchored in the jaw. And while DNA breaks down relatively quickly, proteins are far more robust.
Ah, paleoproteomics.
Exactly. Researchers managed to extract ancient proteins from the enamel of that single tooth. And by sequencing the amino acids in those proteins, they could essentially reverse engineer the genetic code that produced them.
That is so clever.
Isn't it? They compared that reverse engineered protein sequence against the Denisovan genome from Siberia, and it clustered perfectly.
The pristine fingerprint matched the suspect.
The genome finally found its face.
That is just incredible.
Yeah.
And that changed everything for the fossils we already had, didn't it?
It revolutionized the field overnight. Because once we knew what a Denisovan skull actually looked like, paleontologists realized that several other mysterious China archaic fossils skulls that had been sitting in museum drawers for decades, defying classification, actually belonged to this exact same lineage.
Which brings us to the Yangtze 3 discovery. Because this one pushes the timeline back incredibly far.
Right. Yangtze 3 is a cranium discovered in central China that dates back roughly 1 million years.
A million years.
But when it was initially pulled from the earth, it was heavily crushed and distorted by the immense geological pressure of the sediment above it.
So they couldn't just, measure it with calipers on a desk. They had to use digital morphometric.
Exactly. They put the crushed fossil through high-resolution micro-CT scanners. And inside the computer, they could isolate every individual bone fragment, digitally uncrush the compression, and mirror the pieces to recreate its original symmetrical three-dimensional shape.
It's like reassembling a million-year-old crushed 3D jigsaw puzzle.
And when they completed the digital reconstruction, the million-year-old skull exhibited the early morphological hints of Dragon Man.
Oh, wow.
It featured a larger cranial capacity than any Homo erectus fossil from that era, and it showcased a very specific evolutionary trend: the shrinking and in some cases complete agenesis of the third molars.
So it's the missing link.
This fossil essentially acts as the deep-time anchor for the Denisovan lineage, proving they were a distinct, independently evolving branch of humanity for nearly 1 million years in Asia.
Okay, now I have to step in here and address a massive elephant in the room.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Because if anyone listening to this goes online and searches for Denisovan teeth or Denisovan skull, they're going immediately down a bizarre internet rabbit hole.
Oh, the conspiracy theories.
They are everywhere. People see the massive molars, they see the huge skull capacity, and they leap to the conclusion that the Denisovans were a race of 8-foot-tall mythological giants roaming the Pleistocene Earth. We need to explain the actual biology here. Set the record straight.
It is one of the most pervasive myths in pop anthropology, and it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of allometry.
Holometry.
Yes, allometry is the study of how different parts of a biological organism scale in relation to one another.
So the flawed assumption is a linear scale. Like, if the tooth is twice as big, the person must be twice as tall.
Which is biologically false. Evolutionary adaptations don't scale uniformly. The Denisovans were not 8-foot-tall giants.
So how tall were they?
Based on the postcranial bones we do have, they were roughly average human height, perhaps even slightly shorter on average, but they were hyper-robust.
Meaning they were built like tanks.
Think of the biomechanics of an elite modern powerlifter or a front-row rugby forward. They had exceptionally thick, dense cortical bone. Their rib cages were likely barrel-shaped, their hips broad.
And to move all that heavy bone.
To move those massive, heavy bones, their musculature had to be immense. The massive teeth and powerful jaws weren't there because they were giants. They were evolutionary tools designed to process incredibly tough, fibrous vegetation and shear through raw, frozen meats.
So average height, but their physical strength would have been staggering compared to a modern human.
Staggering.
Built low to the ground and incredibly dense to conserve heat in the Ice Age. But this is where the Denisovan story pivots from being just a fascinating morphological case study to something that completely rewrites our understanding of hominid intelligence.
Right, because they didn't just stay huddled in the frozen north.
Exactly. We have long suffered from this deep-seated bias of Homo sapien exceptionalism. We like to tell ourselves the story that we were the only hominin species cognitively sophisticated enough and technologically adaptable enough to conquer multiple, drastically different biomes.
But the Denisovans beat us to the punch across a massive swath of the planet.
So let's examine the extremes of their territory. In the north, they were dominating the Mammoth Steppe. Now, this biome sounds like a fantasy novel setting.
The Mammoth Steppe was the most extensive biome on Earth during the Pleistocene. Picture a vast, freezing, arid grassland that stretched continuously from Spain, across Eurasia, all the way over the Bering Land Bridge into Canada.
And it wasn't empty either.
It was a harsh, unforgiving environment populated by some of the most formidable megafauna in Earth's history. Woolly mammoths, cave lions, cave hyenas, and the massive woolly rhinoceros.
And we know the Denisovans weren't just surviving on the edges of this ecosystem, like scavenging whatever the cave lions left behind. They were the apex predators.
The proof is in the chemistry. Researchers conducted stable isotope analysis on the bone fragments found in Denisova Cave.
Walk us through the mechanics of that.
Specifically, they looked at the ratios of carbon and nitrogen isotopes preserved in the ancient bone collagen.
Why does nitrogen tell us what they're eating?
It has to do with how nitrogen moves through the trophic levels of a food web. There are two stable isotopes of nitrogen. Nitrogen-14, which is common and lighter, and nitrogen-15, which is rare and heavier.
Okay, 14 and 15.
Right. So when an herbivore eats plants, it excretes the lighter nitrogen-14 in its urine more easily, while the heavier nitrogen-15 bioaccumulates in its tissues.
It builds up.
Exactly. Then, when a carnivore eats that herbivore, the process repeats, concentrating the nitrogen-15 even further. By putting the Denisovan bone collagen through a mass spectrometer, scientists measured incredibly high concentrations of nitrogen-15.
Ah, so it's basically a chemical receipt of their diet. The heavy isotopes prove they were sitting at the very top of the food chain.
They were high-level, obligate carnivores. They were actively hunting massive megafauna, including the woolly rhinoceros.
I mean, taking down a woolly rhino with a spear isn't just some casual afternoon foraging trip.
Not at all.
You are going up against a multi-ton, highly aggressive armored animal. That requires immense bravery, sure, but more importantly, it requires sophisticated ecological knowledge, forward planning, complex group tactics, and advanced communication.
They were undisputed masters of the freezing steppe, but their adaptability goes far beyond cold weather survival. We also find their genetic remains in the exact opposite environment on Earth.
Which is mind-blowing. We have to look at the discovery at Cobra Cave.
Down in the Altai Mountains of Laos, this is a total biome inversion.
We are talking about the deep tropics.
A humid, sweltering rainforest environment defined by triple canopy jungle, extreme heat, and seasonal monsoons.
And usually taphonomy in the tropics is terrible for preservation, right? Like heat and moisture destroy DNA rapidly.
They do, but researchers found a Denisovan tooth perfectly preserved in the breccia of Cobra Cave.
So instead of hunting woolly rhinos on an open, frozen plain, they were navigating dense, suffocating rainforests, dealing with entirely different flora, hunting monkeys and tapirs, and surviving tropical pathogens they had never encountered in the north.
The cognitive flexibility required for a single species to thrive in both the Arctic Circle and the Laotian jungle is staggering.
But their southern expansion reveals an even more profound technological achievement. And to understand the true depth of their capability, we have to look at the Wallace Line.
This is where their story intersects with deep geological history.
So what exactly is the Wallace Line?
The Wallace Line is one of the most abrupt and severe biogeographic barriers on the planet. It runs through the Indonesian archipelago, separating the continental shelf of Asia, known as Sundaland, from the continental shelf of Australia and New Guinea, known as Sahul.
And this barrier isn't just some shallow land bridge that flooded recently.
No, not at all. It is defined by deep, ancient oceanic trenches, specifically the Lombok Strait. Even during the absolute peak of the Pleistocene ice ages, when massive amounts of global water were locked up in polar ice caps and sea levels plummeted by over 120 meters,
It still didn't dry up.
the Wallace Line never completely dried up. It remained a stretch of deep, open ocean characterized by incredibly treacherous, fast-moving, multi-directional currents.
So it acts as an evolutionary moat. And we know it was an effective moat because terrestrial animals couldn't cross it, right?
Exactly. The Asian megafauna, tigers, rhinos, elephants, bears, never naturally cross the Wallace Line. They physically lack the buoyancy and stamina to swim across those deadly currents.
So what happened on the other side?
Well, as a result, on the eastern side of the line, you find entirely distinct, isolated ecosystems dominated by marsupials.
But the genetics tell a different story for the Denisovans.
Completely different. When geneticists analyze the genomes of modern human populations alive today, the highest concentrations of introgressed Denisovan DNA by a massive margin are found in indigenous populations in Papua New Guinea, Melanesia, and Aboriginal Australians.
So for those genetic markers to be present there in such high frequencies, the Denisovans, or the archaic populations carrying their genes, had to have crossed the Wallace Line deep in antiquity. And since we just established that terrestrial animals couldn't swim across that evolutionary moat, wait, doesn't that imply they build boats?
It is a logical necessity. You don't accidentally float across the Lombok Strait on a log. To cross that barrier requires deliberate seafaring.
Which completely shatters a long-held, slightly arrogant assumption in archaeology. We used to firmly believe that deliberate seafaring was the exclusive cognitive domain of modern Homo sapiens. We thought we were the only hominins smart enough to be sailors.
Right, but to build a raft capable of crossing open, treacherous water, you have to cross a massive cognitive threshold.
You'd need to plan so much.
You must be able to conceptualize a watercraft, fell the appropriate timber using stone tools, manufacture cordage to lash it together, understand the timing of tides and currents, and perhaps most importantly, utilize a complex language to coordinate the building and the sailing.
The Denisovans were sailors.
They were sailors.
Apex hunters, tropical survivors, and open ocean sailors. If they possessed that level of cognitive complexity, what else were they capable of? Because back in the dirt of that luxury hotel in Siberia, the Denisova Cave, archaeologists found artifacts that challenge everything we thought we knew about the origins of art and culture.
The artifacts recovered from the Denisovan layers are breathtaking in their refinement, and they have ignited a furious debate within the archaeological community.
Let's talk about the jewelry. Because the stereotypical image of a caveman is someone holding a crude, chipped stone hand axe. High fashion doesn't usually come to mind, but they found a bracelet.
They found fragments of a stunning bracelet meticulously carved from a stone called green chlorite. And the mineralogy here is vital. This isn't just a random river stone they bashed a hole into.
It was an aesthetic choice.
Exactly. Green chlorite is relatively soft on the Mohs hardness scale, making it workable, but it possesses a unique optical property.
What does it do?
In the stark, bright light of day, it appears as a dark, somewhat muted green, but when illuminated by the flickering, warm spectrum of a cave fire, it glows with a vibrant, almost translucent, luminous green.
Oh, wow. They chose a stone specifically because it looked magical by the firelight. That is a deeply abstract, artistic choice.
Furthermore, the manufacturing mechanics are highly advanced. The hole bored through the center of the stone, presumably to hold a leather strap, wasn't just chipped or gouged.
So how did they make it?
Under microscopic analysis, researchers observed the concentric, perfectly parallel striations that are the unmistakable signature of a high-speed rotation tool.
They were using a prehistoric drill, like a bow drill.
Experimental archaeologists have attempted to replicate the hole. and it requires sustained, high-speed drilling. After it was drilled, the entire bracelet was meticulously polished to a high-gloss sheen, likely using progressive grits of sand and animal leather.
They had drills, they were polishing jewelry, and it wasn't an isolated incident either. They also found delicate rings carved from marble and mammoth ivory, and incredibly precise, tiny beads crafted from ostrich eggshells.
It's a whole industry of adornment.
But you mentioned a furious debate. Why is there skepticism? Why can't the broader scientific community just universally accept that the Denisovans were master jewelers?
It all comes down to the fundamental nightmare of cave stratigraphy.
Stratigraphy is the study of the sedimentary layers, right?
Yes. The principle of superposition dictates that the oldest dirt is at the bottom and the newest dirt is at the top. But caves are dynamically messy environments. They are subject to bioturbation.
Bioturbation, meaning like animals messing at the dirt.
Exactly. Over tens of thousands of years, cave bears dig deep hibernation dens, churning up the soil. Freeze-thaw cycles, cryoturbation shift artifacts between layers. Later, human occupants dig deep fire pits that cut directly into older, lower strata.
So the timeline gets totally scrambled.
And the chronological window here is tight. Modern Homo sapiens arrived in the broader Siberian region roughly 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, which is approximately the same time period these sophisticated artifacts are dated to.
Ah, I see the skeptic's angle. They're arguing that the Denisovans were just brute cavemen. Modern humans moved into the neighborhood, dropped their fancy jewelry on the cave floor, and a bear eventually kicked it down into the older Denisovan dirt.
That is the conservative orthodox argument, yes. However, the Russian archaeological teams who painstakingly excavated the site argue vigorously that the artifacts are securely locked in sedimentary layers that definitively predate the arrival of modern humans in the region.
So if they're right,
If their stratigraphic interpretation is correct, the Denisovans were engaging in symbolic behavior and personal adornment on par with, or perhaps even preceding, anything our direct ancestors were doing.
it's a tough debate to settle when the dirt is that messy. But there is another artistic artifact, one that cannot be washed away by water or kicked around by a hibernating bear. To see it, we have to travel to Tibet.
The Khian Hot Springs discovery on the Tibetan Plateau. This is arguably one of the most evocative and haunting discoveries in the entire field of paleoanthropology.
It is the most emotional part of this deep dive for me. Walk us through the geology and the discovery.
High on the Tibetan Plateau, near ancient geothermal vents, researchers discovered a massive slab of travertine. Travertine is a dense form of terrestrial limestone deposited by mineral springs.
Okay, so a hot spring deposit.
Right. When the geothermal water bubbles up, calcium carbonate precipitates out, initially forming a thick, warm, pliable mud. Over time, that mud lithifies it, turns into solid rock.
And trapped permanently in that fossilized rock are handprints.
Pressed deeply and deliberately into the mud before it turned to stone are a series of handprints and footprints. And biomechanical analysis proves they weren't made by a large, lumbering adult slipping in the mud.
Who made them?
They are small. They were made by children.
And the layout proves it wasn't an accident, right? Like a kid didn't just fall over.
The prints are carefully arranged. They were placed in a deliberate, overlapping, patterned composition.
And what's the dating on this travertine?
Using uranium-thorium dating, the rock solidifies the timeline at approximately 200,000 years ago.
200,000 years ago. Long before Homo sapiens were painting the caves in Lascaux. Long before our species was anywhere near the freezing altitudes of the Tibetan Plateau. By sheer geographic and chronological elimination, these prints had to be Denisovan.
They are the only viable candidates on the plateau at that time.
I want you, the listener, to just pause and picture the humanity in that moment.
Yeah.
Imagine being a highly robust Denisovan kid living 200,000 years ago. You are hanging out by a steaming hot spring in the freezing mountains of Tibet. You're probably bored while your parents are flit-napping or processing a carcass nearby.
And you see this warm mud.
You see this warm, squishy, inviting mud, and you do exactly what any 5-year-old child today would do. You press your hands into it to see the shape. You leave a mark. It is very likely the earliest known example of parietal art on a wall or floor in human history. And it was just kids playing in the mud.
It is a necessary, profound realization. We spend so much of our time in this field analyzing mitochondrial DNA, measuring the robusticity of molars, and arguing over cranial capacity. It becomes incredibly easy to reduce these hominins to cold data points.
The Kasang handprints change that.
They remind us that these were conscious people. They had families, they experienced boredom, playfulness, aesthetic appreciation, and joy.
They were people. Cultured, open ocean sailing, incredibly adaptable people spread across a massive territory from the Arctic ice to the Laotian jungle. So what happened when they bumped into other human species on their travels? Because they certainly weren't alone on the planet.
They absolutely were not alone. And to understand the mechanics of what happened when these disparate species met, we have to completely discard the old traditional model of the human family tree.
The classic tree with branches.
Exactly. The classic metaphor of a tree, a single solid trunk that branches off into distinct, isolated limbs that never interact again, is functionally dead.
So what's the new paradigm?
Anthropologists now use the metaphor of a braided stream.
Okay, let's trace the mechanics of the braided stream. How does that work?
Imagine a wide, powerful river that encounters a massive sandbar, splitting the water into two separate channels. Those channels might flow completely independently for thousands of miles. They develop their own unique currents, they flow over different minerals. One gets muddy, one stays clear.
So biologically, that represents genetic divergence. Populations isolating and evolving unique adaptations over hundreds of thousands of years.
But eventually, the geological terrain shifts, and those two separate streams crash back into each other, mixing their waters completely before perhaps splitting off again further down the valley.
So hominin lineages split apart, evolve completely separate morphologies to adapt to the tundra or the jungle, and then they migrate, physically run into each other, swap genetics, and merge back together.
Precisely. And we have the ultimate, undeniable biological proof of this braided stream in action. We have to return to Denisova Cave and to the teenage girl by the river we discussed in the intro.
Denny, the 13-year-old biological ghost.
In 2012, researchers subjected a heavily fragmented long bone splinter from the cave, officially designated Denisova 11, to advanced nuclear DNA sequencing.
So unlike the initial pinky bone, where they only looked at the maternal mtDNA,
this time they mapped her entire nuclear genome. They could see exactly what alleles she inherited from her mother and her father.
and the results were so mathematically improbable that the scientists initially assumed their machines were broken, right?
They assumed massive sample contamination. They reran the sequencing protocols multiple times, but the data was flawless.
What did it show?
By analyzing the heterozygosity of her genome, meaning the presence of two entirely different sets of genetic instructions at specific loci, they determined that Denny's mother was a 100% full-blooded Neanderthal, and her father was a Denisovan.
I need to make sure the listener grasps just how wild the statistics of this are. She wasn't someone who had a Neanderthal great-great-great-great-grandparent.
No, she was an F1 hybrid, first-generation direct descent. A Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father met in the Altai Mountains, mated, and had a child.
I have to use an analogy here because it's just so crazy. Imagine you have a massive giant glass jar filled with millions of jelly beans. If you reach your hand and completely blindfolded on your very second try, you pull out a super rare half-cherry, half-lemon hybrid jelly bean.
Yeah.
What is the logical deduction about the jar?
It tells you the jar is probably overflowing with hybrids.
We have only successfully sequenced a tiny microscopic handful of individuals from this cave, and one of them just happens to be a first-generation F1 hybrid.
Statistically speaking, the odds of randomly uncovering an F1 hybrid in a fossil record that's sparse are astronomically low, unless hybridization wasn't a rare anomaly, but rather a common, frequent occurrence.
They weren't practicing prehistoric social distancing at all.
Not at all. Denisova Cave wasn't just an isolated shelter for one insular group. It was a prehistoric cosmopolitan crossroads. It was a localized hub where different branches of humanity migrating across the vast steppes met and merged their waters in the braided stream.
And Denny's father's DNA held even more secrets about how deep this stream goes, didn't it?
It did. When geneticists looked closely at the Denisovan father's side of the nuclear genome, they found that he, too, had inherited Neanderthal ancestry roughly 300 to 600 generations prior.
Wow, so this wasn't just a one-off Romeo and Juliet scenario in the Pleistocene.
The merging of the streams had been happening continuously for tens of thousands of years. But even more shockingly, his genome contained about 4% of what geneticists classify as super archaic DNA.
Super archaic. What does that mean?
It refers to a deep, ancient evolutionary lineage that diverged from our common ancestor well over 1 million years ago. We don't even have a formal taxonomic name for the species yet.
Could it be Homo erectus?
It might represent a late surviving relic population of Homo erectus, or it might be something entirely undiscovered. But the Denisovans were actively interbreeding with them too.
They were walking across Asia acting like genetic sponges, absorbing DNA from everyone they encountered. And there's a newly sequenced genome that pushes this behavior incredibly far back in time. Denisova 25.
Yes, the Denisova 25 genome was extracted from a hominin tooth recovered from the cave dating back roughly 200,000 years.
200,000 years.
It currently stands as one of the oldest high-quality genomes ever sequenced, and it proves that even a fifth of a million years ago, the Denisovans were already heavily intermixing with Neanderthals and those unknown super archaics.
This braided stream is chaotic, which brings up a radical, almost heretical theory about where we Homo sapiens actually came from. Because if Neanderthals and Denisovans were splitting and mixing all over Eurasia a million years ago, where does that leave our ancestors?
It deeply complicates the traditional out-of-Africa narrative.
The classical model being that the common ancestor of all three branches lived in Africa.
Right, and sapiens stayed behind and evolved, while the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans left and adapted to northern climates. But some researchers analyzing this complex web of genetic introgression and morphological data, specifically linking it to very old, mysterious fossils found in Spain like Homo antecessor, are proposing a provocative alternative.
Walk us through the reverse migration theory.
What if the common ancestor of all of us actually lived in Western Asia or the Middle East?
Wait, really?
The theory suggests that from this central Eurasian hub, one branch headed west into Europe to become the Neanderthals. Another branch headed east across the steppes to become the Denisovans.
And the third branch.
The lineage that would eventually become us actually migrated back into Africa, where they evolved in isolation into Homo sapiens for hundreds of thousands of years before finally erupting back out of Africa 60,000 years ago.
That flips the script entirely. Our ancestors might have been the ones who turned around and went back to the cradle, while the robust cousins took over the Eurasian landmass.
It completely reframes our origin story.
So we have this incredible, diverse, multi-species world. You could literally walk from the Iberian Peninsula to the Siberian tundra to the Indonesian jungle, and you wouldn't just meet different cultures, you would encounter entirely different species of humanity.
A true Lord of the Rings world.
Which brings us to the most inevitable and perhaps the heaviest question of this deep dive. With all this successful intermingling and extreme adaptability, why are we the only ones left standing?
The mechanics of their disappearance.
What actually happened to them? Let's trace the timeline of the fossil record.
In the north, in places like Siberia and Tibet, the physical remains of the Denisovans seem to rapidly fade from the archaeological and genetic record roughly 50,000 years ago.
Which, not coincidentally, is exactly when modern, anatomically advanced Homo sapiens arrive in those specific regions.
The chronological correlation is impossible to ignore. But we cannot view their disappearance as a single, uniform, global extinction event.
Why not?
Because in island Southeast Asia, the mechanics of the timeline are radically different.
Right, the tropical Denisovans down by the Wallace Line. How long did they survive the arrival of modern humans?
Geneticists use molecular clocks to estimate the dates of introgression events. By measuring the length of the Denisovan DNA tracks in modern genomes, because DNA tracks break into smaller pieces with every passing generation, they can calculate exactly how recently the interbreeding occurred.
So what did the clock say?
Those models indicate that in the dense rainforests of Southeast Asia or the remote islands of Melanesia, pockets of Denisovans survived much, much later. They may have been actively interbreeding with modern humans as recently as 30,000 or, incredibly, even 15,000 years ago.
Wait, let's contextualize 15,000 years ago. That is functionally yesterday in geological time. That is the end of the last ice age.
It is incredibly recent.
That means Denisovans could have been alive while modern humans were domesticating wolves into dogs and developing the very earliest precursors to agriculture in the Levant.
It is entirely possible and genetically probable that they overlapped with behaviorally modern human cultures for tens of thousands of years in those isolated island regions.
So why did they eventually vanish everywhere? Did we systematically wipe them out?
That is referred to as the dark theory, direct economic competition and kinetic violence. We know Homo sapiens are a highly aggressive, deeply resource-hungry, rapidly multiplying species.
Yeah, we tend to take over.
As our populations exploded and expanded, we may have simply pushed them out of the most productive hunting grounds, violently outcompeted them for vital shelter, or engaged in direct prolonged conflict. In a zero-sum ecological game for elite Pleistocene resources, we won.
But there is another theory, right? One that relies less on genocide and more on the mechanics of the braided stream.
The assimilation model. The make love, not war theory.
How does that work?
We didn't necessarily hunt them to extinction. The Denisovan populations, as apex predators, were likely smaller and more geographically dispersed. When the massive, numerically overwhelming wave of modern Homo sapiens washed out of Africa and across Asia, we absorbed them.
We just bred them out.
We interbred with them so heavily that their distinct physical morphology and localized genetic lineage simply dissolved into our massive gene pool. They didn't vanish into thin air. They were consumed by the sheer demographic weight of our populations.
Which means they are still here.
Exactly. Their legacy is walking around on two legs today, operating modern technology.
So let's map that legacy. Let's explain exactly who carries this archaic DNA today, because this is where a listener's own genetic testing results become a literal history lesson. Who has the ghosts inside them?
It breaks down geographically based on those ancient migration and introgression routes. If your ancestry is strictly European, you likely have little to absolutely no Denisovan DNA.
Because they never made it to Europe.
Right, you carry Neanderthal DNA, but the Denisovan wave never pushed far enough west to impact those populations.
What about populations in mainland Asia?
Populations of East Asian descent, such as modern Chinese, Japanese, and Korean individuals, usually carry a very small trace fraction of a percent of Denisovan DNA.
But the real concentration, the heavy genetic signature, is found further south.
Down in Oceania, if you look at modern Melanesians, Papua New Guineans, and Aboriginal Australians, the genetic signature skyrockets. They can carry up to 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes.
4 to 6%. To put that in perspective, that is the genetic equivalent of having a great-great-grandparent who is an entirely different species of human. That is a massive chunk of functional biological code. And this DNA isn't just sitting there inert, is it? It's not genetic junk.
Far from it. This brings us to the biological concept of adaptive introgression. The DNA we absorbed from the Denisovans is doing incredibly heavy lifting in modern human biology. You could argue that the Denisovans granted us evolutionary superpowers.
Superpowers. Let's break down the mechanics of those powers. Start with the roof of the world, Tibet.
The Tibetan Plateau is an incredibly hostile environment for hominins. The altitude is extreme and the air is dangerously thin, lacking sufficient oxygen. If a typical low-altitude human travels there, they suffer from hypoxia.
Because there's no air.
Their body panics at the lack of oxygen and tries to compensate by overproducing red blood cells.
But that compensation mechanism is dangerous, right?
It can be fatal. The overproduction of red blood cells drastically increases the hematocrit levels. It essentially turns the blood thick and viscous, like sludge.
Wow, that sounds awful.
It is. This can lead to fatal heart attacks, strokes, or severe altitude sickness.
But the indigenous Tibetan people thrive there. They climb high-altitude peaks with ease.
They thrive because they possess a highly specific variant of a gene called EPAS. This gene acts as a regulatory switch for the body's reaction to low oxygen.
How does it work?
It actively downregulates the production of red blood cells, allowing their blood to remain thin, low viscosity, and flow efficiently even at extreme altitudes. When geneticists sequenced this EPA1 variant, they discovered it did not evolve naturally within the Homo sapiens lineage.
Let me guess. It was a perfect match for the pristine fingerprint from the cave.
It matched the Denisovan genome identically. The Denisovans had been living on the Tibetan Plateau for hundreds of thousands of years. They slowly, painfully evolved this high-altitude biological adaptation through natural selection.
So when modern humans arrived,
When modern humans finally arrived and interbred with them, we essentially copied their genetic homework. Without the introgression of that specific Denisovan gene, the colonization of the high Himalayas by Homo sapiens might have been biologically impossible.
we borrowed 100,000 years of hard-fought evolution in a single generation of interbreeding. That is the ultimate biological shortcut. What about other superpowers?
In the extreme cold of the Arctic, certain Inuit populations carried gene variants related to the regulation and distribution of brown adipose tissue.
Brown fat.
Right, which is highly efficient at generating heat via thermogenesis. This vital cold weather adaptation also traces directly back to the Denisovan lineage.
So they gave us the biological tools to climb mountains and survive the ice. What about the humid jungles down south?
Down in Southeast Asia and Oceania, modern populations carry introgressed Denisovan HLA alleles. The HLA system, the human leukocyte-antigen complex, is a critical component of the immune system. It helps the body recognize foreign proteins and pathogens.
When our ancestors showed up in the jungle.
When our Homo sapien ancestors migrated out of Africa, their immune systems were completely naive to the unique tropical diseases, parasites, and pathogens of the aerial jungles.
We were walking completely unprotected into a biological buzzsaw.
Exactly. But the tropical Denisovans had been living with those specific pathogens for millennia. By mating with them, our ancestors acquired instant, highly localized immune defenses. It allowed them to survive the jungle.
But biological shortcuts usually have a cost. Is there a downside to borrowing a 50,000-year-old immune system from a ghost species?
Unfortunately, yes. Evolution is always a brutal game of trade-offs. That hyper-aggressive, highly reactive Denisovan immune response was absolutely essential for keeping our ancestors alive in a prehistoric, parasite-rich jungle.
But today,
We live in a modern, relatively sterile, sanitized world. We aren't fighting off Pleistocene jungle parasites. But that archaic immune system doesn't know that.
so it misfires.
Researchers have strongly linked some of these introgressed archaic immune genes to modern autoimmune diseases. The hypervigilant immune system, lacking ancient parasites to fight, mistakenly attacks the body's own healthy tissue.
The ghosts are keeping us alive, but sometimes they attack the machine. This brings us to a profound realization about what it actually means to be human today.
It utterly destroys the simple linear narrative of who we are.
Let's bring this full circle. We started this journey with a teenage girl, Deni, standing by a freezing Siberian river 90,000 years ago. For over a century of modern science, she and her entire species were utterly invisible to us. And now we find her hiding inside the cellular structure, the immune systems, and the blood of billions of people living today.
It deeply humbles our sense of anthropocentrism. We have this pervasive, arrogant assumption that Homo sapiens were destined to rule the earth, that we were simply better, smarter, more adaptable, and fated to be the lone survivors.
But this evidence proves that wasn't inevitable at all. We weren't the only ones building ocean-going boats or making complex jewelry or taking down rhinos. We were just one stream in a massive, chaotic, braided river of humanity.
And that leads to a fascinating final paradigm shift, something to really mull over based on the biomechanics, the genetics, and the timelines we've explored today.
Let's hear it.
If the Denisovans survived on those isolated islands until 15,000 years ago, and if they donated the exact genetic superpowers, the high-altitude EPA-S1 breathing, the brown fat cold resistance, the vital HLA immune system boosts that fundamentally allowed Homo sapiens to conquer the far reaches of the globe, then perhaps our entire standardized concept of extinction is completely flawed.
Okay, I see where you're going. What do you mean?
What if the Denisovans and the Neanderthals never actually died out in the traditional biological sense of a failed species?
What if they didn't fail?
What if instead they simply sacrificed their distinct physical identities, their unique morphological forms, to become the biological and evolutionary scaffolding that built modern humanity?
They didn't die, they just dissolved into us.
The next time you look in the mirror, realize that you aren't just looking at a pure, unadulterated Homo sapiens. You are looking at a living, breathing museum of all the remarkable humans who came before.
The ghosts are right there staring back at you. Such a powerful thought to leave on. Thank you for walking through this incredible timeline with me.
It is always a privilege to explore these deep waters.
Keep looking for the ghosts, everyone, and we will see you on the next deep dive.